Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Amateur Radio Technician class, session number 8. During our previous session, we looked at a Q&A. We saw where we were in the curriculum. We mentioned again the practice exams. Then we delved into radio waves, electric and magnetic fields, radio wave velocity. We talked about the relationship between frequency and wavelength. Also, we discussed bands and wavelength, as well as the various propagation modes. Then we discussed multipart propagation, as well as repeater and reflection. And we completed the technical discussion with knife edge diffraction. And of course, we ended the session with our usual question pool review. In this evening's session, we will be looking at our Q&A. We have a couple of questions. Also, we will be looking at where we are in our curriculum. Also, again, mentioning the practice exams. Then we get into our technical topics for this evening. Antenna polarization, followed by radio wave polarization. Then we discuss what sporadic E is, as well as auroral backscatter, meteor scatter. Then we get into tropospheric scatter or tropospheric ducting, as well as the effects of weather on propagation. Then we discuss a little deeper ionospheric propagation. We talk about the 11-year sunspot cycle, and we will end the technical topics by discussing HF signal propagation fading. Afterwards, we will do our usual question pool review and then announce the date for our next session. So we had a couple of questions from the last session, and let's get straight into those questions. The first one was, how do I obtain an FRN number to do the exam? So that's a good question. And on your screen, this is the URL or the website to register on what is called the FCC ULS course website to get your FRN number that you required to for the exam. Of course, we would have covered this in session number 1 in a little more detail. So we encourage you to review slide number 23 of session 1, or if you could actually review session 1 itself, the recordings are all available to you, and you'll get quite a bit more information than we'll be able to tackle in the Q&A. So anyone who is wondering how to take exams, if you missed session number 1, please kindly review the recording. Second question is this class also being recorded? And the answer is yes. We are recording all sessions, or at least we are attempting to. We are making all efforts to do so. And we do include the link to all of the recordings, at least the previous session, in the email that we sent to participants, as well as we have been sending a link to a playlist of all of the recordings as well. So every participant in the class should by now have a good feel for the recordings where you can access them. And if anyone does not, please feel free to ask a question and we'll see how what best we can do to assist. So all recordings thus far have stuck, more or less, and are available. Again, hasten to add, we are not able to guarantee that the recordings will stick. Now it goes with technology. Another question, a good one. What is MW, SW, and UHF? So that was a good question. Again, we'll refer you to our couple of slides that we have put up where we reference the different frequencies, the wavelengths, and also what the band names are. We had a couple of slides and we just sort of snapped them and put them onto this slide so you can see what we are talking about. However, MW stands for medium wave, and it is typically interpreted as the frequency range between 300 kilohertz and 3 megahertz. Shortwave, which is SW, is usually interpreted to be between 3 megahertz and 30 megahertz. And UHF is ultra high frequency, which is 300 megahertz to 3000 megahertz or 3 gigahertz. So that's why we have these tables here. They're all in those tables, and you can have a look at them and reference them to one another in your review. So very good question. Right, another question, a very good question indeed, and highly technical one. So let's go. It says, how does one mitigate the negative effects of multipath propagation? So we talked about multipath propagation the last time. We said you have the direct signal that's leaving the transmitter, going to the receiver, and then you have other pathways that those signals could get to the receiver, maybe bouncing off of a building or some other object, and it will arrive at a different time via a different pathway. And we talked about that being problematic in that you can have all sorts of issues with the signal being distorted and faded and so on. So the participant asked a question, well, how do you mitigate? How do you deal with that? Or can you do anything about it? So on your screen are a couple of things. We wouldn't go into the detailed explanation of each of these, but on your screen are a couple of the techniques that radio operators, amateur radio operators, and communications engineers implement to deal with that phenomenon known as multipath propagation. So the placement of the antenna could be important. Maybe you put it a little higher so that the direct signal there's a better chance of that signal being stronger or getting there to the receiver. You can use directional antennas. There's something called diversity as well, where you will have multiple antennas at the receiver end, and there's some logic inside of there that will determine which is the best signal to use. Also something called equalization using DSPs or digital signal processing. The receiver can use logic and compensate or correct for those distortions. You can change the frequency to one that is less prone to that. And of course, there's something called time and frequency diversity. Also, not on your list here, you can use horizontal polarization that might be less prone to multipath propagation. That's one technique that hams could use. Also, not on your list here, but there's something called beamforming, which is a technique that can also be used to counteract multipath propagation. So those are some of the things that can be used to deal with the negative effects of multipath propagation. So I hope that answers the question for the participant. And you can research a little further. We have underlined the concepts, some of them. Also research beamforming as well as another option. And of course, the technique that you use will be highly dependent on the application, the resources that you have available, and of course, the nature of the multipath environment. So bear that in mind. All right, so that's the Q&A. Let's go into our curriculum progress. Well, this is where we are. We should be wrapping up this topic, radio wave characteristics, this evening. So let's try and get through everything and complete so we can move on to the next topic for the next class. Just a reminder again about practice exams. These are the links. We put up several of them because we cannot guarantee that all links will be available at all times, and we wanted to make sure that participants have access to practice exams that you can see where you are at with respect to your knowledge as you go through the course. Again, we make the point you don't have to wait until the course is complete for you to go online and take these practice tests. Also, the course material, we are using the No Nonsense Technician Class License Study Guide. Folks, so some persons are still saying they don't have it, they don't have access to it, they never got it. So it's included in the first couple of sessions as attachments. All sessions going forward, we do have a link with that goes to all of the documents that we have shared, not only the No Nonsense Guide, but also all of the supplementary material, as well as all of the slides. So if there's still anyone after saying all of that cannot access it, please let us know. Also, please make sure you use the version that we would have emailed to you or is contained in that link. A student, unfortunately, I think had been using another version so there are several versions of this book, right? The question pool expires every 4 years. So there's usually a new book. All of the texts that are study guides will expire in 4 years, and the authors usually come out with a new book. About 20% of the question pool are either adjusted or edited. So always use the latest version. So please do use the version that we would have emailed to you or that's contained in the link in the email that you get every week. Very important. Otherwise, you may be studying the incorrect question pool. All right. So let's pull it back a little bit and see, before we go into some of the theory that we have carded for this evening, let's pull it back a little bit and see what we are trying to achieve in amateur radio, in ham radio, and the course itself. We aim to pass the exam to become licensed hams, but let's take a look at what we are trying to achieve. So on your screen, we have a radio, or what is commonly called a transceiver. And you'll see the radio, there's a microphone associated with the radio that we can speak into. That radio is powered via some power supply. In this instance here, it's a battery supplying 13.8 volts to the radio. It could have easily been a power supply, or what we call an adapter or converter, or some other form of power to the radio. And there's a cable that goes between the power supply and the radio. And you have your radio connected to an antenna, because it's amateur radio, we're talking about ham radio. So there's an antenna, and to connect the antenna to the radio, there's something called the feed line. There are different types of feed line, and we'll come to those things later on in the course. But we just wanted to give an idea, when we're doing all of this theory, how is it applied, or what is it going to be applied to? And this is it. I mean, there may be different types of radios for different frequency bands, different features. You may have separate radio receivers and transmitters, or you may have a combination transceiver. But essentially, this is the setup, and this is what we're aiming to become proficient in and utilize. There are many other components along the way that's not shown on the diagram here, different components that we will encounter as we go forward in the course. But this is what we're talking about when we're talking about radio wave propagation, when we're talking about signals coming off of an antenna. This is the setup we're talking about. We're hoping to speak to someone, or in some cases, we may connect a computer to the radio and use the computer and let the computer do the talking. But by far and large, whether it's a mobile radio or a base radio like this, or whether it's a handheld walkie-talkie, we're all really just trying to use some power to power a radio transmitter to transmit our signal through an antenna, and also to receive a signal coming in from someone else. So we have transmitter and receiver, sender and receiver, or source and destination, right? That's what we're trying to achieve using radio equipment. So towards the bottom right of your screen here, you'll see one station and another station. So we're trying to get our signal from this station to the other station using radio waves. So we have labeled this a transmitter, and we have labeled the other one a receiver. But remember, you can be both a transmitter and a receiver depending on your function at the particular time. So that's why we refer to transceiver. So it's not that you are only a transmitter or you're only a receiver. In two-way radio, we tend to be both, right? So notwithstanding how these diagrams are labeled, the idea is that we have two stations, transmitter and receiver, and there's a radio signal that we're trying to send between the two. We're trying to get it efficiently, effectively, and those signals, when it leaves one antenna, goes out into free space or into the air and goes to the other antenna. We refer to that as propagation of the radio signal. So this is just to set a little context in what we had discussed previously and what we're about to discuss now. We'll be talking a lot about antennas, radio frequency, and orientation of these antennas. So we just wanted to set the stage that there's a practical application to all of the theory that we're about to deal with, right? So hopefully this is a good reference point that we're talking radio. So keep this in the back of our minds as we discuss further. Right. Okay, so we're about to discuss the concept of antenna polarization. So on the left-hand side of your screen, you will see two radio antennas. 1, 2, right? They are distance apart. But what we would like you to pay attention to is what we refer to as the polarization. You may consider the orientation of the antenna. Notice how these two antennas are vertically oriented or vertically polarized. Remember when we spoke about the radio waves, we said it had an electric component and a magnetic component. So it's an electromagnetic wave. So we just put this up on your screen so that we could reference those concepts as we go into other concepts. Because when we define a radio wave or an antenna and say it's vertically polarized, we need to bear this model in mind, that there's an electric field and a magnetic field associated with our radio wave or with our electromagnetic wave or electromagnetic frequency. So notice these two antennas are oriented top down or vertically. They're vertically polarized. So when we talk about an antenna being vertically polarized, this is what it means. They are oriented this way. But when we say it is vertically polarized, we are really referring to the signal that leaves the antenna or is received by the antenna. And we need to recognize that it's the electric field that we are talking about whenever we are referring to the polarization of an antenna or the radio signal. So this first point that you have here is that an antenna is said to be vertically polarized when its electric field is perpendicular. This is perpendicular to the Earth's surface. Parallel is this way. Perpendicular is this way, right? So don't let the terms tie you up too much. But it's vertically polarized, and this is how it looks. So let's compare and contrast now that to horizontal polarization or being horizontally polarized. So the intent behind putting the antennas slanted this way, it's really intended to convey that it is flat. So if you were to rest these antennas on a table, for example, and it's flat on the table, that's actually what we mean. But because this is a two-dimensional space that we're using to try and create a three-dimensional view, we have put it at an angle like this. But this is really flat. If this were on your table and the antenna is horizontally polarized, it would be flat on the table. So I'm hoping that you can picture that even though it looks like at a bit of a slant or an angle, it's really flat. It's parallel to the Earth's surface. It's parallel to a table that you would put it on. So these are horizontally polarized antenna. By us orienting them this way, they are horizontally polarized. And for our purpose as amateur radio operators, it's the electric field that of the signal, the radio frequency that will emanate from the antenna or be received by the antenna, that is what we consider when we're talking about horizontal or vertical polarization. So just bear that in mind. It's the electric field as opposed to the magnetic field that we'll be talking about. So horizontal polarization. Notice these two antennas are horizontally polarized, whereas these two here are vertically polarized. Let's look at the diagram towards the bottom right here. We have two antennas again, one of which is vertically polarized and the other one is horizontally polarized. A little later on in the slide deck, we will come to dealing with that, what happens when you have one antenna horizontal and one antenna vertical. There are issues with that, as you probably could have guessed, right? Polarization is important. Okay. So when we talk about a radio wave polarization, it's the electric field that we're talking about. And here's this trusty diagram again, showing that when you have a radio wave or electromagnetic wave or RF that's leaving an antenna, there are two components. You have the magnetic field and you have the electric field. And whenever we talk about the polarization, we pay attention to the electric field, and that's an exam question. So the property of a radio wave that defines its polarization is the orientation of the electric field. So if the electric field is up-down, then that's vertical polarization. If the electric field is left-right or across, then that is horizontal polarization. So this is an exam question that you need to know, that polarization refers to the orientation of the electric field. All right, so we also need to know what happens or what should happen as an amateur radio operator with respect to your antenna orientation. And the previous slide we saw where we could have the antennas horizontally polarized or vertically polarized, and it matters in many cases, because if one amateur radio operator were to have their antenna vertically polarized, and they're trying to communicate with another amateur radio operator whose antenna is horizontally polarized, let's say in the VHF or the UHF part of the spectrum, then Houston, we have a problem. And we are trying to illustrate that these two diagrams at the bottom here, right? So we have a transmitter that is transmitting a vertically polarized signal. And remember, we said vertically polarized means that the electric field is what we are talking about. So the electric field is vertically polarized. It goes this way. And the antenna happens to be a vertically polarized antenna. So the antenna, consider the antenna to be this slot. So the antenna will happily receive this vertically polarized wave. No problem. Maximum signal reception, maximum signal transfer. Because the signal is vertically polarized and the antenna, the slot here is vertically polarized oriented and it receives it maximal. But imagine you have a situation here on the other side where your signal is vertically polarized. It's up, down, top, down. But your antenna, which is this slot here, is now horizontally polarized. So you have a vertical signal, but a horizontal antenna. What do you think will happen? Well, you might get some of the signal, but you will not get the maximum amount of signal because the antenna is not polarized or oriented in the same way as the signal, right? And that's the actual last bullet point on your screen here. It says when antennas at opposite ends of a VHF or UHF line of sight radio link are not using the same polarization, the received signal strength is reduced. So it doesn't mean that you'll get no signal, you know, but it's not optimal because it's not aligned. The receive antenna is not aligned with the transmitter antenna to receive the maximum power transfer or signal transfer. All right. And on the top left here, this diagram just shows, okay, if you have an antenna that is sending out a vertical signal, so it's electric field that's vertical. But remember, radio frequency also has a magnetic field that is going to be 90 degrees, right? So we have just put in here only the electric field to illustrate polarization. So when it goes up and down like this in the vertical plane, it's a vertical polarization. When it goes side to side like this, it's in the horizontal plane. And we have a couple more slides that will, if we didn't catch it on these slides here or these diagrams, we have a couple more slides that will hopefully help us to aid in understanding this concept of vertical and horizontal polarization. Because remember, we really kind of see the RF, the radio frequency wave that leaves an antenna. You don't see it. So you have to imagine it. So we draw what it should look like if we were able to see it. So let's go to, so these are two exam questions that you need to learn. Hopefully the concept is explained so you understand these bullet points. Right. So a couple more slides that aims to help us understand this concept of vertical polarization and horizontal polarization. So if this were to be an antenna that is vertically polarized, the signal that leaves will be vertically polarized, something like this. If the antenna were to be horizontally polarized, it should leave the antenna and leave something like this, right? Not the best example, but hopefully we are gleaning the idea of vertical polarization and horizontal polarization of radio waves, right? On the right-hand side here, we have another way to remember, and sorry for those who may be averse to reptiles, right? If we have a snake, right? If you ever look at how a snake travels, it sort of wiggles side to side. And of course, the proverbial serpent, if you ever look at the serpent goes up, down, right? So the up, down motion of the serpent, think of that as the vertical polarization of the wave, vertical polarization of the antenna. And the side to side of the snake, the slithering side to side, is horizontal polarizations. So for those who can connect with this concept, hopefully that has helped us to understand and visualize a radio wave that is leaving an antenna and it's being horizontally polarized or vertically polarized. Again, we have our trusty little RF diagram here that shows that you have, in addition to the electric field, you do have a magnetic field as well, right? But when we're talking about polarization, we are referring to the orientation of the electric field. Exam question. All right, so let's make it real a little bit here again to illustrate, you know, again, this concept of vertical and horizontal polarization. So what we have here on your screen, it's two diagrams. The first one at the top is intended to show a mast or a pole that has an antenna mounted on it. And this antenna has elements. We will come to antennas and the fact that they call this a Yagi antenna and what it means a little later on in the course. But if we were to just note that this is an antenna that is sending out a signal, a radio wave from it, the polarization, how this antenna is physically mounted, where the elements are top down, means that the antenna is vertically polarized. And it also means that the signal, the radio frequency signal that will be leaving it when we transmit, we use our radio and we transmit into this antenna, will be vertically polarized as well. The bottom diagram here, it's the same antenna as above, but instead of us mounting it physically where the elements are up down, we have mounted it flat across, left to right. So again, it looks slanted here, but then that's just because we are trying to illustrate a three-dimensional object on a two-dimensional plane or space. So this is actually flat, right? So it's a different orientation to the antenna at the top. So you have horizontally polarized antenna at the bottom, vertically polarized antenna at the top. And the signal leaving the vertically polarized antenna will be vertically polarized. Again, it's the electric field we're talking about. It does have the magnetic field as well accompanying it. But polarization is in relation to the electric field. The bottom diagram, you'll have the electric field horizontal because the antenna is physically mounted with horizontal polarity, and therefore the signal is also horizontally polarized. Hopefully that is starting to concretize the idea of horizontal and vertical polarization. Let's go to another diagram. All right, so you might have thought, is there any other type of polarization for antennas and radio signals besides horizontal and vertical? Well, you probably guessed yes, there are many other forms of polarization. So not that we will need to get into it, or not that we'll be discussing it much just yet, but in the question pool, some of the wrong answers may be the other types of polarization. So we've just put up, for your information and reference, a graphic that shows the different types. So we have the horizontal polarization. So the radio wave is horizontal here, meaning the electric field is horizontal. We have a vertically polarized radio wave leaving the antenna. So the electric field is vertically polarized. But we can have dual polarization. We can have cross polarization. We can have, and I think one of the distractor answers, we can have a right-hand circular polarization. You could also have a left-hand circular polarization, right? So just bear in mind there are different types, but we are now talking about horizontal polarization and vertical polarization. All right, so let's come to an exam question in relation to polarization. So you may remember this diagram from 2 slides ago where we have a mast and we have our antenna and it's horizontally polarized. That means the signal is horizontally polarized. And you may be wondering, well, do hams or do amateur radio operators use vertically polarized antennas or horizontally polarized antennas? Well, hams use both and select which one depending on the application, the frequency, practical considerations, so many other choices to be made. But we need to know for the exam that normally horizontal polarization is used when we are doing long distance CW. Again, we would have mentioned it before. Anytime you have CW, it means continuous wave, but translate that as Morse code. Persons may be familiar or heard of Morse code. So anytime you see CW, it's Morse code. Dits and das, right? Did it da, right? That's not voice, it's Morse code. And SSB, which we'll come to later on in the course, it means single sideband, but anytime you hear SSB, think voice. So CW is a digital form of communications. Where some people think it's dots and dashes, right? Or dits and das, or it's tones. And you have SSB, single sideband, which is voice, or sometimes what we refer to as phone mode, right? On the VHF and UHF band. So this is an exam question. Let's just dissect it again. We're saying that horizontal antenna polarization, so you know what that means by now. It means that you mount the antenna horizontally. You have to physically mount it like this. It wouldn't go so by itself. You have to do that. You have to tie it. You have to strap it down. You have to tighten the bolts to make sure it's horizontal. So horizontal antenna polarization is normally used by hams for what? Long distance CW and SSB contacts. And a contact it just means that you're speaking or you're communicating with another amateur radio operator. But on what bands? On the VHF and UHF bands. So this is an exam question, and this is also true. So hams, you'll find hams for those very long distance CW and voice or SSB contacts. You'll see hams turned in the antennas sometimes horizontally. You'll see many times hams use vertical polarization as well. But just note this for the exam. It's an exam question. Right. Okay, let's just do maybe this slide and we'll take a break and we'll come back with the rest of the slides. So we would have mentioned the ionosphere before, and we will come to it again in a little bit, but we're just introducing another slide here to talk about the ionosphere, right? So what is the ionosphere? So if we were to imagine this being the Earth, and just by the way, you're probably wondering how come there are two sides to the Earth? Well, it just means that this part of the Earth is in daylight, the sun is facing it, and this part of the Earth, well, there's no sunlight, right? So this is the Earth here. And if we were to look above the Earth into the sky, what we call the atmosphere, we will see that there are different layers. But if we were to look on the left-hand side here, we are looking at the height above ground level or sea level. So when we go up, there are different names to the levels. So this is the ground level or sea level. And when we look up all the way to the sky, all the way to space, we will see that there are different layers. You have clouds at the different layers, but each of the layers, they have a different name. So you don't need to learn all of these for the exam, but just to let you know, we have the troposphere, which we'll talk a bit more about. There's the stratosphere, there's the mesosphere, there's the thermosphere, and we have a couple of layers called the ionosphere. So from the ground up, you have different layers as we look up into the atmosphere, right? Or into the sky as we look up. And we need to know about the ionosphere. We'll also need to talk about the troposphere in a little while. So these are the layers. But if we were to come back to the Earth here, you will see that above the Earth, we have the ionosphere, layers of the ionosphere. So we have not put in the troposphere, the stratosphere, the mesosphere, and the thermosphere. We as hams are very interested in the ionosphere. And we'll come in a little while again to define what the ionosphere is, right? In another slide, we'll actually repeat the slide and get a little deeper. But we want to start getting a little more into this thing called the ionosphere. And we need to recognize that there are different layers of the ionosphere, as we saw in this diagram. And they have names to these layers. You have the D layer, you have the E layer, and you have the F layer. And sometimes in the daytime, that F layer splits into two, the F1 and F2. Sometimes they call regions, right? So you have either the D region or the D layer, the E region or the E layer, and you have the F region or the F layer. And in the nighttime, it merges as one, that F layer, back into one F layer or F region. In the daytime, it splits into two because of the sun, and we'll come a lot more into how the sun affects the ionosphere. But the ionosphere is critical, is important to amateur radio operators. So we'll be discussing the ionosphere in more detail in some upcoming slides. So for now, we need to take our usual midway break. Just about 2 minutes. We can get up, take a stretch, maybe have some water, bathroom break, and we will come back in 2 minutes time. All right. So, yes, good evening, there, Adish. Good evening, Paul. Sure, will do. Uh, Christopher, we were looking at about 16 sessions. I mean, our first session was really, we didn't cover any material. It was just orientation. We may go a little a bit above 16, maybe 17 sessions. A lot of it is really determined by the Q&A as well. That could affect it a bit. So I would say 16 to 17 is what we're aiming for. It could be above that. Let's see how it goes, right? Clarence, yes, you're quite right. So television antennas, those VHF, UHF TV antennas that used to be on top of our roofs, some of us may still have them. Yes, they were horizontally polarized. You're quite correct. Excellent observation. And that's actually one of the references we used to use before, but there are not so many around again. And when you tell people about those TV antennas, it's like, what are we talking about? So very excellent point there for those of us who recall or still have access to see those big TV antennas. Now with cable and fiber and so on, I mean, not so much, right? But I think there's still quite a bit of installations, and I believe persons are still installing. I know at one point in time, DirecTV would have also installed an antenna for the free-to-air signals. So it's still very relevant indeed. Excellent question there, Clarence. All right. Okay, so let's recommence. All right, so hopefully everyone is back, and let's start again. So we need a little bit more time again this evening. We are trying to cover all of the material, so we do appreciate the extra time if you can spend with us. If not, the recording hopefully is going to stick and you could catch up, right? All right, so we talked about the ionosphere. Let's go to the next slide. Right. Right, so we need to be aware that as hams, and you will hear us mentioning this ad nauseum, there are a couple of things that as hams we like to do. As amateur radio operators, as technical practitioners, we don't just hold a radio in our hand and turn it on and use it. That's one of the things we do, but we tend to go a little bit further. We tend to do technical investigations. So if we're not getting our signal, as we might have mentioned last week, remember when we said that we couldn't get the signal to the repeater, so we might want to use a directional antenna and try and bounce the signal off of something, maybe a water tank on a hill, to get to the repeater? Well, if you thought that was, in passing, something a ham might do, hams actually do that quite a lot. And what that thing is bouncing signals off of objects. Again, we mentioned it last week, and you will see that we bounce radio signals off of many things, off of almost anything. As a matter of fact, if you stand up too close to a ham, they might look at you and probably try to bounce a signal off of you. That's to tell you how important bouncing signals are for hams. So don't be surprised when you hear all of these strange, very strange things that amateur radio operators will try to bounce a signal off of. So the first concept in terms of propagation of our signals by bouncing. So the first thing that we try to bounce off of, it's not a very predictable thing that we can say it's going to be there for us all the time, but there's a phenomenon called sporadic E. The question is, what is sporadic E? Matter of fact, what is E to begin with? So remember we talked about the layers of the ionosphere, and we'll just go back a slide. Remember we said the ionosphere has different layers. There's the D layer, there's the E layer, and there's the F layer, and there's sometimes even the F layer, F1 and F2, because it can be split during the daytime and recombined in the nighttime. So D, E, and F. So those are the layers. So when we talk about the E layer, or E, or the E region, this is the layer we're talking about. So when we talk about sporadic E, Sporadic E refers to the E layer. So again, this is the Earth here. And you have the E layer above the Earth, which is the ionosphere E layer. Every now and again, something causes a cloud of ionized gas to appear in the E layer. Again, it's not very well understood, but there are several factors that are believed to cause it, and it is observed for a period. And that cloud in the E layer, when we bounce off a signal off of that E layer, that cloud that develops on the E layer, we call that sporadic E propagation. Some people you'll note it as ES, right? So sporadic E is when we have a transmitter on the Earth's surface here, and we're trying to get our signal across somewhere the other part of the Earth. It cannot go via the ground wave. It's not line of sight, but so we need to bounce it off of something, let it reflect or refract and jump at the other side of the Earth. Well, we can use that feature called sporadic E, that little cloud that will develop and allow us to bounce our signal. So that is one example of hams bouncing signals. And it's very effective, especially in the VHF part of the spectrum. So when we're talking about sporadic E, it's usually the VHF bands that we're talking about. And we need to pay attention when we are doing various operations in amateur radio. It's really frequency dependent. So when we talk about one phenomenon or feature, it will apply to a particular frequency range and maybe not other frequencies. So we need to pay attention when we're talking about the different propagation modes or medium, that we pay attention to what frequency range we're talking about. So we're talking here about VHF. And again, that's why we have this slide that shows what is VHF, what is UHF, what is HF. As hams, we need to become familiar. We need to get au courant with those terms because we'll be using them regularly. Like right now, I'm saying sporadic E and we're talking about using VHF. Someone will say, well, could we use UHF? Some may ask a question, well, can we use HF? So this sporadic E is really a cloud of ionized gas that is formed, very unpredictable, very intermittent, and it will form on the E layer of the atmosphere, really the ionosphere, and we can bounce our signal off of it, right? So we do have an exam question related to that. And we already discussed it. It's called sporadic E. And we did say we use it a lot for the VHF part of the spectrum. But of course, the exam question doesn't use the term VHF, right? So let's see what the exam question is. It says that sporadic E is a type of propagation most commonly associated with occasional strong signals on the 10, 6, and 2 meter bands from beyond the radio horizon, right? So certainly the 2 meter band is VHF, right? The 6 meter band is VHF, right? The 10 meter band might be considered part of the HF band, the upper part of the HF band, right? So they don't say VHF, but this is the exam question, and this is what you need to learn for the exam. In respect of sporadic E, when this phenomenon occurs, amateur radio operators take advantage of it on the 10 meter, 6 meter, and 2 meter bands. That allows us to transmit and receive signals beyond the usual distance, because the signal is able to go up to that cloud, sporadic E cloud, and bounce to the other side of the Earth, and so on. So that's sporadic E. So again, we say that hams, we love to bounce our signals off of any and everything really that we can legitimately do. So believe it or not, another object, if you want to call it that, that is used to bounce signals, radio frequency signals off of, is the aurora. So some of us may be familiar with aurora. Some of us might have seen it live. Some of us might have seen it in pictures or video. But aurora, what it really is a phenomenon where there's a display of light that occurs in the sky, and it usually occurs in the upper latitudes or towards the polar regions of the Earth. And it happens both on the south and north poles. And it is actually caused because sometimes there are charged particles that leave the sun and arrive at Earth. So if you have ever heard of a coronal mass ejection, or what is called a CME, or you might have heard of solar flares, or you might have heard of coronal holes, and there are other phenomena that the sun will eject particles such as protons and different charged particles. And when those particles interact with the Earth's magnetic field, you can have a very pretty light display. So on your screen, the top here, that's an example of what an aurora looks like. Of course, you have the one in the northern hemisphere and you have one in the southern hemisphere. It's actually called aurora borealis. That's the northern version and sometimes called the northern lights. And you have the southern version called aurora australis, and also known as the southern lights. So these lights, believe it or not, amateur radio operators do try to bounce our signals off of that so that it could reach further than we would otherwise through line of sight or other forms of propagation. So again, we're also talking about the VHF part of the spectrum and maybe even the UHF part of the spectrum. That's what we do, bounce our signals. And that's an exam question, right? So again, this one, they don't talk about 6 meter and 2 meter and so on. They're actually going to say VHF. So exam question is, a characteristic of VHF signals received via auroral backscatter is that they are distorted and signal strength varies considerably. So if you were to look at the diagram on the right-hand side, let's see what we're actually trying to do here. We have a transmitter that's located on the Earth's surface somewhere here. And we're trying to get to someone on the other side of the Earth, maybe halfway around the world. And we're trying to bounce our signal off of the aurora so that it could drop on the other side of the Earth. That's what we are trying to achieve. So that aurora is varying. When you look at the light is not steady. So it's varying, it's moving, those particles are moving, the light is moving. So when we send our signal up into the sky, it bounces off the aurora and comes back down to Earth to the receiver. That signal may not be steady at all. So it could be noisy, it might fluctuate, it might flutter, and all sorts of things. So it's not ideal, but it is better than no communication at all. And that's why hams like to bounce our signals off of things to get the message there, to get the signal there. So this diagram here shows the aurora in the sky, and we on Earth here sending our signal to it, bouncing it off of the aurora and dropping it back down, if you could visualize that. So auroral backscatter, it's called. All right. Well, believe it or not, we also try to bounce our signals off of meteors. Well, not exactly the meteor itself, but the trail that it leaves behind, right? So some of you in this class who are saying, oh my gosh, really? We do that? That's a thing? Yes, it is. So you're probably wondering, how often we get meteors. But if you have ever looked up and seen a shooting star, for example, that would probably be a meteor that's coming through the sky, burning up, and you see that colored streak. When you see that streak, it's leaving back ionized gases. It's ionizing those layers in the atmosphere. And because it's ionized, it's charged, guess what? Hams, we can send our signal to that ionized area to bounce our signals off of it. Now, you'll probably be saying, but wait a minute, when I see a shooting star, it just lasts for maybe a couple seconds. Well, exactly. So as hams, when we bounce our signal off of the meteor, really the trail, it's really just often for a very short time, just a couple of seconds. Again, we also use the UHF part, the VHF part of the spectrum to do that. Some will try the UHF part of the spectrum, right? So if I'm on Earth here, and this is my transmitter, and I'm transmitting my signal, I know there's meteor bursts going on, so therefore it's ionizing trails in the atmosphere. My signal will go to that ionized trail, bounce off of it, and drop on the other side of the earth. And I've just done propagation via meteor scatter. So the person on the other side, the receiver, will hear me, and they will also try their best to send us a signal. They will transmit a signal back up, hoping that it will reciprocate and that signal will bounce off of the layer that the meteor created and send it back down to me. And hopefully we can have a very short conversation, but literally it's seconds at best. So there's not a whole lot of time. Sometimes you only get the signal in one direction and the person hears you, and that's great. So these are some of the things that amateur radio operators do, believe it or not. And we have an exam question associated with meteor scatter, which is we need to learn for the exam that the 6 meter band is best suited for communicating via meteor scatter. So remember we said VHF, so 6 meters is part of the VHF spectrum. If you need to convince yourself of that, check that trusty table that we have put up on several screens before. It's in your slide deck, and it's a good thing to print if you wish to have handy, where you have the frequency spectrum, the wavelengths, as well as what meter band it is. So 6 meters is typically used for meteor scatter. Right. So there's another phenomenon that occurs. So remember, we are just trying to get our signal to the other side. We're trying to communicate. We're trying to use our transmitter, create a radio signal that leaves our antenna, goes into the sky or the space or wherever it goes, into the air, and arrives at another location wirelessly, so that the person receives my signal and they will be able to interpret it, understand it, and then they may wish to return a transmission to say they have gotten my message or add a message to it, and they will transmit back to me. That's what we're trying to do. So we are trying to propagate our radio signal, and yet another means of radio wave propagation is what we will refer to as tropospheric ducting. All right, so we did talk about the troposphere a little earlier when we looked at the layers of above the Earth's surface. So we come to a phenomenon known as tropospheric ducting. What is that? Well, let me just switch to the other slide that will give us a better view of what it is about, and we'll come back to this slide. Okay, so on the top right hand corner, well, before we do that, let's do the bottom left hand corner. So this is our Earth's surface. Above the Earth's surface, there are layers. The troposphere is one of them. And many of us will know and recognize that as you go up in height above the Earth's surface, temperature tends to get cooler. Right, so if you ever climb a mountain, you say, whoa boy, it's kind of cool or cold up here compared to down below. That's one observation. If you have ever flown in an airplane, and all of these planes now have a screen that you could track where you are, and it will also tell you the outside temperature, and then sometimes you see something like minus 15 degrees Celsius, and you are like, wow, is that cold up here? Yeah, because as you go up, typically it gets colder. Not always, there are some exceptions, but generally as you go up, you get colder. So as you leave the Earth's surface, above the Earth's surface, you have cool air. And sometimes you will have a layer of warm air that is sandwiched between 2 layers of cold air in the troposphere. So you have cool air, warm air, and cool air again, or cold air. So if we were to go the bottom right, this is represented, maybe if we are not getting the picture yet, we use several diagrams that will hopefully help us to understand and cement the idea, right? So again, we have the Earth's surface, we have our transmitter, we have our receiver. We're trying to get our signal propagated so that we can communicate. And this is the tropospheric layer, or the troposphere. There's a cool layer of air, there's a warm layer of air, and there's also another cool layer of air. So that, again, another illustration of what we're trying to do. Here's a diagram now that shows our radio systems. We have the transmitter and the receiver. We see that the signal leaves the transmitter, it goes up. So we have the cool air layer here, we have a warm air layer here, and we have a cool air layer here. So it's this warm layer of air is sandwiched between the bottom cool layer of air and the top cool layer of air. And that allows the signal to do some bouncing inside of there, or ducting really, along this pipeline. And that is the phenomenon known as tropospheric ducting. It requires those layers of air, or what we call temperature inversion, for that phenomenon to occur. So let's come back to this slide. Right? So you have a little definition of it on top here, but for the exam, what we need to know is that tropospheric ducting is a type of propagation that is responsible for allowing over the horizon VHF and UHF communication to ranges of approximately 300 miles on a regular basis. So let's dissect what they're saying here. So we're talking about the phenomenon known as tropospheric ducting. It's a propagation former. Remember, when we're talking propagation, we're talking about we're trying to move our radio signals from one place to another. We're trying to communicate. And that phenomenon is responsible for allowing over the horizon. So remember, we said that line of sight, you have signals that will go line of sight, and we say VHF and UHF are typically line of sight. It doesn't go anymore. Sometimes you can have a little bit more based on what we had talked about with a little bending, that the radio horizon is a little bit further than the typical line of sight, but that's the maximum. But because of tropospheric ducting, it allows that signal to go further than the horizon. That's what this is saying here, to ranges of approximately 300 miles, again, using imperial units. So 300 miles on a regular basis, and that's an exam question. So you need to know for the exam that tropospheric ducting is a mode of propagation that allows the signal to go a little further than it will otherwise go, the VHF and UHF signals, beyond the standard horizon to approximately 300 miles on a regular basis. That's the exam question that you will get. You will also get another question as to what causes or enables tropospheric ducting. So we did show you that you have a cool layer, you have a warm layer, and then you have another cool layer above. So a warm layer sandwiched between two cool layers, and I did mention a little earlier that we call that temperature inversion, and that is the exam question. Temperature inversions is the atmosphere, in the atmosphere causes tropospheric ducting. So it's as simple as that. So again, you may want to review this a little bit to concretize, but these are the ideas. You can have a little read of this little explanation here on your own time, right? So I did ask for some extra time, folks. We're going to try to cover all the rest of the material, and then we still have the question pool to do. So let's see how quickly we can go through. So again, this is the diagram showing the tropospheric ducting. We have our signal that is leaving the Earth's surface, going through the ducting process and ending on the other side of the Earth. Again, it's beyond the normal line of sight. Quite some distance it can be as well, right? All right. So a question that might have crossed your mind is, does weather affect radio propagation? Can it? And the short answer is yes, it can. Oftentimes very little, and other times very much. So it depends, right? So weather such as rain, fog, all sorts of other weather phenomena can affect radio wave propagation. So as amateur radio operators, we need to be conscious of that. We need to be concerned, and therefore we need to optimize our transmissions to take into account the effects of weather. So there are some things that we need to know about weather and how it affects our radio signals. Remember earlier, we would have said that a lot of things that we discuss as to phenomena and properties of radio waves depends on the frequency of that wave. In other words, what band are we talking about? So we have a couple other questions that are in relation to specific bands or specific frequencies. So while we are talking about weather affecting radio signals, They want us to know that above a certain frequency, weather definitely affects radio signals. Below a certain frequency, not so much, hardly, just a little bit. So let's go to those questions in the question pool that speaks to that. So they want us to know that precipitation, now when we talk about precipitation just means rain or snow, right? That's what precipitation is a weather condition that might decrease your range at microwave frequencies. So you see, they're trying to tie us up here. So we need to know what microwave is. So we have just put into brackets here for you. It's between 1 gigahertz and maybe about 300 gigahertz. So certainly above 1 gigahertz is considered microwave frequencies. So we will discuss that a little bit to help us how to remember what microwave frequencies are about. So you need to know that rain can affect your radio signal, but only for frequencies that are above 1 gigahertz, meaning the microwave frequencies. Okay? This is an exam question. Second exam question they will ask you about, and they expect you to know that there is little effect on of fog and rain on signals on the 10 meter and 6 meter bands, right? So the 10 meter band, that's the 28 megahertz frequency, and the 6 meter band, that's the 50 megahertz frequency, right? So again, why that trusty table could be helpful to you, because they'll be telling you about frequency in megahertz and gigahertz. They'll be talking about frequency in wavelength. They'll be talking about the meter band, 10 meter band, 6 meter band, and so on, right? So you need to be able to comfortably convert between the two. So these lower frequencies in the spectrum are really not affected too much by certain weather phenomena such as rain and fog. There are other phenomena that might affect it, like lightning and so on. But rain, not too much effect on the lower frequencies. But the higher frequencies, yes, definitely. That's simply what these 2 bullet points mean. But you need to learn these for the exam. All right. Let's see if we could make things real a little bit, visualize things a little bit. Some of us are a little more visual. So first of all, we are talking about microwave frequencies. And you might be thinking that microwave frequencies, that's something I do not know about. That's something new to me. I really have no idea what that is. But if you have ever used a microwave oven, you already know what microwave frequencies are, believe it or not. Because in your microwave, when you put some food on a plate and in the microwave to heat it up a little bit, or maybe you want to cook something using the microwave, it's radio waves that's generated in there. It happens to be on the 2.45 gigahertz frequency. That's the frequency that's generated inside of microwaves. That is part of what we call the ISM band, or the Industrial Scientific Medical Band. It's also the same band that you will find Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and so on, right? So you already know microwave frequencies. If you have used a microwave, if you have used Wi-Fi, those are on microwave frequencies. So we say that microwave could be considered anything above 1 gigahertz, right? 1 gigahertz and above could be considered microwave frequencies, right? Just loosely. So you already know about microwave frequencies. On the bottom left is a little diagram that shows, it's a graph that shows the attenuation or the reduction in signal for radio frequencies, different parts of the spectrum, and the type of precipitation, whether it's a torrential rainfall or maybe it's just light rainfall, how much it affects the signal. So you can have a look at this on your own time. Those of you who are interested always like to have references and cross-referencing. This is not any exam, but it can help you understand what frequencies are affected by weather and to what extent. And on the right-hand side here, just some additional information of these so-called microwave frequencies, talking about the L band, S band, C band, X band. All these things are not on your exam, but again, just a bit of extra information. And as much as we are amateur radio operators, we should be interested in everything frequency related and wavelength related. So all of these things really just to create a perspective and to concretize what we already know, perhaps with something else. So extra information, none of this is on your exam. Okay, so again, at this point, we reintroduced this diagram. We have seen this before because we said we needed to know what is AHF, VHF, and UHF, and all the rest are extra pieces of information. But we have just added in here to show where the microwave part of the spectrum is, you know. So remember we said it's about 1 gigahertz and above to about 300 gigahertz. Yeah, it's about there, because above that, you all might have heard of millimeter wave. You know, if you have ever gone into one of those airport scanners, they'll tell you, well, it's millimeter wave technology. But we are talking about microwave frequencies, and we just thought we should, you know, reference it to show you where the microwave frequencies are. It's here, it's not up here, it's not in the HF part of the spectrum. You know, it's kind of the UHF and above. So hopefully all of this referencing is helping us to create a perspective of where one thing is reference another. Because there's a lot of information, a lot to learn, but sometimes knowing where it is relative to something else might help us remember. So the microwave, when we talk about microwave frequencies, it's in this part of the spectrum. And again, microwave, as in your often, is 2.45 gigahertz. That's the frequency. If you were to measure it on a spectrum analyzer, that is where it will be. And that's why sometimes you might say, but wait, I just dropped off my Bluetooth. I was playing some music through Bluetooth, or my Wi-Fi signal all of a sudden dropped off when I turned on the microwave. If it's close enough, yes, because you could have some leakage. Not a good thing, but you can have some leakage, and it can affect your other transmission. So microwave, you should probably already be somewhat familiar with. It's not a stranger. Again, we also put this diagram back up just to keep it real, you know, keep reminding ourselves when we talk about HF and VHF and UHF, and when we talk about the 2 meter band and the 6 meter band and the 10 meter band. Again, these tables, good to print out, have handy, because this is what we need to become familiar with as amateur radio operators. The quicker we can get some level of familiarity with this, the better it will aid in our understanding. Okay, so folks, I did say we go in a little overtime again this evening, just to cover the material. So we're coming back now into the ionosphere. What is the ionosphere? So on the right-hand side, you have seen this diagram before. This is the Earth's surface. We see above, we have the troposphere, we have the stratosphere, we have the mesosphere, we have the thermosphere, and others. But we note that we have the ionosphere, we have the ionosphere D layer, the ionosphere E layer, and we also have the ionosphere F layer. And we said in the daytime, when the sun is overhead, it can split into the F1 and F2 layers. So that's the ionosphere. But what exactly is the ionosphere? So here's a bit of information about it. It's a layer of the Earth's upper atmosphere, and it's affected by the sun. And the sun will affect those ions and free electrons and those layers. The ionosphere is important to amateur radio operators, especially for HF, high frequency propagation. You see why it's important to know HF, VHF, UHF? Because remember we said hams, we love to bounce our signals. So the ionosphere is one of those things that we bounce our signals, or we reflect our signal, or we refract our signals off of. And what that does, it allows us to achieve long-range communications, because we are getting our signal, transmitting it, it bounces off of the ionosphere and drops to a distance further away, or it bounces to another layer of the ionosphere and drops a little further away. So that's the whole idea of utilizing the ionosphere for amateur radio. You have seen this diagram before, but we're gonna go over a little bit again because we need to be familiar. This one on the left-hand side, we have looked at it several times in today's course. We have the Earth's surface, we have the different layers, troposphere, stratosphere, mesosphere, and so on going up. And on the right-hand side here, if you were interested in knowing what altitude, you would have these different layers. Here it is in kilometers and miles. So you could look at this if you want to get a reference to it. Yeah. So, right. On the right-hand side, again, we have the Earth and we have the various ionospheric layers. So you have the D layer, the E layer, and the F layer. So these are all layers. And on the right-hand side, we have an earthlet, a sunlit Earth. The sun is present on this side of the Earth, and therefore the ionosphere layers are a bit different to the dark side of the Earth at the moment. One of the differences is that the F region usually split into two, the F1 and F2, where there's daylight, where the sun is striking the Earth. Where it's dark, that F region comes down into one layer. And those are important things for the future, for your course. And there's also the E region that exists as well. It exists in the nighttime, exists in the daytime. And notice in the daytime, there's this D region as well. So this is what the ionosphere is about. This is where it's located, and hams will bounce or attempt to bounce our signals off of the ionosphere. And again, we mentioned that we can bounce it off the ionosphere. It could come back down to Earth, bounce again to the ionosphere, come back down to Earth with multiple hops or skipping. So that is also possible. And those are the things that amateur radio operators love to utilize, those phenomena, to communicate further and further away. All right, so just a couple more slides. So again, these slides are trying to reinforce some of the concepts that we had earlier, and also to point out the question pool exam, the exam in the question pool, exam question in the question pool. Our diagram on the right-hand side, you've seen that several times before, so it's just there as a reference, but we're introducing this diagram to show that if you have a transmitter and you have a receiver somewhere else, when your transmitter transmits the radio signal, it's propagated into the sky, and the ionosphere is what will cause that signal to be bounced off of to come back down to Earth. It's reflected, really, we use the term refracted and bent back down to Earth and drops. And that is what allows that long distance, because the ground wave doesn't go very far, or it doesn't go as far as it will go when it goes to the ionosphere. Because if the frequency is too high, it will just simply go through the ionosphere. But once it's these HF frequencies, the ionosphere will bounce or reflect or refract or bend the signal back down to Earth. And this is the question in the question pool. This is an exam question. We need to know that the region of the atmosphere which can refract or bend HF and VHF radio signals is the ionosphere. So that's what you need to learn for the exam. All right, just another reference diagram. We hope that's helpful. We have our transmitter on the Earth's surface here. We have our ionosphere layer above the Earth. And then we transmit, and there's a ground signal that goes to about here, but no further. But then, because we like to bounce our signals off the ionosphere, it bounces off the ionosphere, and look how far we are able to communicate. Right? So just another reference diagram. You will encounter this diagram later on in the course as well when we talk about the skip zone. Okay, again, another diagram to emphasize the whole idea of communicating via radio waves and bouncing it off of the ionosphere. And we do have a related exam question. So again, we have our transmitter here, we have our receiver here. And just remember, even though we're talking transmitter receiver, a person who is a transmitter at this moment can be a receiver another moment, right? So just bear that in mind. So our radio signal will leave over the surface wave and probably get as far as here. We have something called, they call it the space wave. It will go into the air. But then we have the sky wave. It will go all the way into the sky to the ionosphere and bounce or reflect or refract off of the ionosphere. And we, of course, use it, that feature. The exam question, we need to learn this for the exam. A characteristic of HF communication compared with communications on VHF and higher frequencies is that long distance ionospheric propagation is far more common on HF. Matter of fact, happens all the time, right? It can happen a little bit on VHF, right? But it is very common on HF. HF frequencies, again, remind ourselves, what is HF? Let's just go back to the slide. We're saying HF, VHF, right? HF is frequencies between 3 and 30 megahertz. Yeah. So here's the other slide, HF. Once we say HF, typically we are talking about between 3 and 30 megahertz, typically. Yeah. Or approximately. Right. So HF communication, that's what we're talking about. Between 3 and 30 megahertz or so. Yeah. Okay. So we come to talk now a bit about the sunspot cycle. So I'm not going to read out everything on your slide. You will get the slide deck. You can have a read of this. This is not on your exam, but we need to know about the sunspot cycle that the sun goes through every 11 years. On your screen on the top right, you will see some splotches on this is the sun, and these splotches are what are called sunspots. They are not cold by any means. They're very hot, but they're colder areas compared to the rest of the sun. So they look as darkened regions on the sun. And those are called sunspots. And the sun goes through a cycle every 11 years where you have a peak where there are many sunspots, and then it goes to a period where there are very few or little sunspots. And that cycle occurs every 11 years. Why that is important is because the particles that emanate from the sunspots, when they reach the Earth's surface, will ionize those layers of the atmosphere, the ionosphere, and allow ham radio operators to use the ionosphere even more or better to propagate our radio signals. So amateur radio operators love it when the sunspot cycle is at its maximum, where there are lots of sunspots, and therefore those particles leave the sun in these regions, get to Earth, and ionize the atmosphere, ionize the ionosphere, that causes HF radio frequencies to propagate very, very easily for very long periods of time, daytime and even nighttime. Yes. Okay. So these are just some diagrams to show the sunspot cycle. I wouldn't get into it. This is just for your reference. This is just a table of the start and end dates of previous cycles. By the way, we are in cycle 25 now. Right, so I'll spend a moment or so on this. This is a current graph. It was actually screenshotted just today. And it shows where we are in the current sunspot cycle. So this 25 here on your screen represents that we are in cycle 25. The previous cycle was called cycle 24. So this was the previous cycle, the actual, and this graph shows the number of sunspots. There's a related thing called solar flux index, which we'll cover later in the course, but we are concerned here about sunspots at the moment. So readings are taken and it's plotted. So notice that this is the actual sunspot numbers over cycle 24. But cycle 25 that started, the red line shows what the anticipated or the expected activity levels is as far as the number of sunspots. This purple line with the diamonds would represent the actuals. So we are in 2023. So this is 2023. And you may notice that the actuals are significantly above the average of what is expected. It's above even the maximum expected. This is what we expect out of cycle 25. But cycle 25 has shown that generally it's been higher in terms of the number of sunspots, which is a good thing for amateur radio operators. So just FYI, not on your exam, just useful information. So here's a slide that would be for you to read on your own time. It gives a little bit of information about HF propagation, HF frequencies, how they work during the daytime and during the nighttime and periods in between. Because we did say that the sun ionizes the ionosphere differently during the daytime, of course. During the nighttime, when there's no sun rays striking the dark side of the earth at that point, the ionosphere behaves differently. So you may want to know, well, what frequency responds well in the nighttime? What frequency responds better in the daytime? And this slide gives you that information. Right. So we are close to the end of the slides, folks. Just a couple more. So this table here summarizes for the various bands, the various, typically the HF bands really, what layers of the ionosphere is employed or used, and whether it's suitable for use during the daytime or the nighttime. So for example, here we can see that the 160 meter band is good for the nighttime, but notice, not good for the daytime. We will see here that the 17 meter band is good for the daytime, and it might be good for the nighttime, right? But we'll see here that the 10 meter band is typically good for the daytime, but it not really suitable for the nighttime. There are exceptions, of course, like in the peak of the sunspot cycle that we are going through right now. Yes, you can have very good propagation on 10 meters, even in the nighttime, right? So this is the type of things that hams have to look at, propagation forecast, the rules of thumb that we mentioned earlier in choosing what frequency to use at what time of the day or night. That is essentially what it implies. As a ham, you have to choose the appropriate frequency for the appropriate time. So of course, we have a couple of exam questions related to that, meaning what time of the day would be best for communication for a particular band, and what layer of the ionosphere is used. So I've just sort of circled on this diagram here the ones that are related to the questions in the question pool to make it a little easier to reference. So the first point, bullet point, that you need to learn for the exam is that the 6 and 10 meter bands, so recognize that the 6 meter band is really part of the VHF spectrum. The 10 meter band is clearly part of the HF spectrum, but it's in that little transition zone. So the 6 and 10 meter bands may provide long distance communication via the ionosphere's F region during the peak of the sunspot cycle. So that's why we said, normally it won't, but yes, in this case it would. So you need to learn this for the exam. Also, very much related, talking about the 10 meter band, is that from dawn to shortly after sunset, and I put here daytime, that's what from dawn to shortly after sunset is. Early in the morning to late in the evening. So from dawn to shortly after sunset during periods of high sunspot activity. So again, let's go back. Right, so low sunspot activity, high sunspot activity. Okay, so this is why we showed you this graph. At this point is the bottom of the cycle, very few sunspots. Here is the top of the cycle. If we were to look at cycle 24, this is the top of the cycle here. A lot of sunspots, 100 and something sunspots per day. At the bottom of the cycle, hardly any. Not that there aren't any, but it'd be far and few between. Sometimes you have none on the surface of the sun that we can see, right? So bottom of the cycle, top of the cycle. Okay, so that's what we mean by from dawn to shortly after sunset during periods of high sunspot activity. That's where you have the peak. is generally the best time for long distance 10-meter band propagation via the F region. So that's why we highlighted it here for you. You have the F region, you have the 10-meter band, and you can have some good daytime propagation during the high sunspot activity period. Yeah. Okay. So I think the last concept that we have for this evening's theory would be something known as HF propagation fading. So if we were to look at this diagram, you'll see we have a transmitter on the surface of the Earth here and another radio operator receiver on the surface of the Earth here. So a signal may leave the Earth, go up to the ionosphere, drop back down to Earth, go back up to the ionosphere, and get to the receiver. It may also go via one hop in this way, go up to the ionosphere and go back down. So we have two questions in relation to that phenomena where, because the signal arriving at the receiver may arrive through different pathways. One is through this double hop, one is through a single hop. And you might be thinking, but wait, where have I heard that before, right? So yes, you'll be quite correct. We have heard something like that before. But here we are talking about HF propagation, right? So through the ionosphere, the signal goes up to the ionosphere, comes back down, bounces off of the ionosphere again, and arrives at the receiver. It may also take this pathway at the same time. And therefore, you have two signals arriving at the receiver end. And that could cause the signal to appear to be coming and going. It may have some distortion. It may sound as though it's fading one moment and getting stronger, because these signals are combining, and it may be destructive to each other. It may be constructive to each other when they get there. What does that sound like? If you were to say multipart propagation, you'll be quite correct, because that's where we saw it, except that those were typically VHF and UHF signals and bouncing off of things like buildings and water tanks and those solid objects. In this case here, we're talking about HF propagation, but you have the same thing where the signal will arrive at the other end through various pathways that causes the signal to be affected. All right, so for the exam, we need to know a likely cause of irregular fading of signals propagated by the ionosphere is random combination of signals arriving via different paths. So again, similar to the concept of multipart propagation. Another exam question, need to learn this also, a result from the fact that signals propagated by the ionosphere are elliptically polarized is that either vertically or horizontally polarized may be used for transmission or reception. So let's take a moment to discuss what that is very quickly. If our signal leaves the Earth's surface and goes to the ionosphere and is refracted down to the Earth on the other side here, while it might have started off as a horizontal polarization or a vertical polarization, because it's refracted at the ionosphere, when it comes back down, it becomes circularly polarized. In other words, it doesn't necessarily mean horizontal, or it doesn't necessarily mean vertical. And we did give a slide that shows what circular polarization is, but you don't need to really know much about that, other than that when your HF signal goes up to the ionosphere and comes back down, that you can use either horizontal or vertical polarization. Your antenna could be either horizontally polarized or vertically polarized, and it will work. You don't have to worry about whether the person on the other side is using horizontal or vertical polarization. And the reason is that when it goes to the ionosphere and it's refracted and comes back down, it becomes elliptically polarized. Sorry if I said circular polarization. It's elliptically polarized, okay? All right, I think that's it for the theory. So we have gone a bit over time, and I do appreciate the extra time, folks. Let's just quickly go through the questions in the question pool, and we'll call that a wrap. Okay, so in the interest of time, we will just speed through the questions, folks, because we have gone through all of the theory. You just want to see what it looks like in the question pool. So the first question is, what property of a radio wave defines its polarization? So you may recall we talked about one of the fields defining it. Was it the magnetic field? No, it was the electric field. So the orientation of the electric field determines whether what the polarization of the radio wave is, whether it's horizontal or vertical or something else. Next question. What happens when antennas at opposite ends of a VHF or UHF line of sight radio link are not using the same polarization? So we show that diagrammatically. We show that when they are in fact polarized in the same plane, you get maximum signal. But if it is that one is not, it's opposite, you have horizontal and vertical, the signal received is very small. So the answer is reduced signal strength is reduced. Or I say again, received signal strength is reduced. Okay, next question in question pool. What antenna polarization is normally used for long distance CW and SSB contacts on the VHF and UHF band? So we said it is usual for hams to use horizontal polarization for that. Next question. Which of the following types of propagation is most commonly associated with occasional strong signals on the 10, 6, and 2 meter bands from beyond the radio horizon? So that was the phenomenon known as sporadic E propagation. Next question in the question pool. What is a characteristic of VHF signals received via auroral backscatter? So remember, we are sending the signal up to the aurora and come back down, but remember the aurora is very variable. It moves, it changes almost in an instant. So therefore, those signals, the characteristics are, they are distorted and signal strength varies considerably. Next question. What band is best suited for communicating via meteor scatter? So we did say that 6 meter is very popular and very suitable for meteor scatter propagation. Next question. What type of propagation is responsible for allowing over the horizon VHF and UHF communications to ranges of approximately 300 miles on a regular basis? Right, so you remember where we showed that you had the cool air, you had a layer of warm air, and above it you had the cool air. So you had that sandwich, and we said that was a ducting arrangement. That's tropospheric ducting because it takes place in the troposphere. What causes tropospheric ducting? Well, we said it's those temperature differences, cold, warm, cold. So the answer is temperature inversions in the atmosphere is what causes tropospheric ducting. Next question in the question pool. What weather condition might decrease range at microwave frequencies? So we did say that for those very, very, very high frequencies, weather does, so precipitation, which will be things like rain and snow and so on, does affect those microwave frequencies. Next question in question pool. What is the effect of fog and rain on signals in the 10 meter and 6 meter band? So we said on those lower frequencies, this is not microwave frequencies we're talking about, they're lower than. We're saying that there's very little effect. Okay, couple more questions. Which region in the atmosphere can refract or bend HF and VHF radio signals? So we only learned about one layer that does that. It's not the stratosphere, it's not the troposphere, it's not the mesosphere, it's the ionosphere that bends and refracts the HF and VHF signals. It's the ionosphere. Next question. What is a characteristic of HF communication compared with communications on VHF and higher frequencies? So the characteristic is long distance ionospheric propagation is far more common on HF. So that's the beauty about HF using the ionosphere to communicate. Next question in the question pool. Which of the following bands may provide long distance communications via the ionosphere's F region during the peak of the sunspot cycle? So we did say both 6 meters and 10 meters. So you have to learn that for the exam. Next question. What is generally the best time for long distance 10 meter band propagation via the F region? So we did say that's during the daytime when you have high sunspot. So that's from dawn to shortly after sunset during periods of high sunspot activity. Okay, so notice the other options that they have here to try to tie you up, right? Okay, couple more questions again. What is a likely cause of irregular fading of signals propagated by the ionosphere? So we learned about that. We said that random combining of signals arriving via different paths is the cause of that. Next question, and the last one for this evening. Which of the following results from the fact that signals propagated by the ionosphere are elliptically polarized? So that was the last concept we just discussed. It means that either vertically or horizontally polarized antennas may be used for transmission or reception. So it doesn't matter whether it's horizontal or vertical. You will be able to communicate. So folks, I do thank you for the extra time that you've been able to spend with us this evening. Want to wish everyone all the best for, let me just go back quickly to the question pool. Sorry, to the slide deck. Right. Yeah. So our next session is scheduled for Friday, the 9th of June at the usual start time, 8:30 p.m. So I'd like to wish everyone a very good night. All the best. Be safe. Take good care and see you in the next class.